Well, I think we can get started. Welcome, everyone. This is a important and special occasion. The classes are over, but our intellectual discussions continue. And we're very happy to welcome the World Order program Patrick Cohrs, who will be speaking about his new book. He has it's quite weighty, both physically and intellectually, so we look forward to hearing it today. Let me say a few words about Patrick. He is a professor of international history at the University of Florence, where he specializes in 19th and 20th century international politics, history of international politics. He has held many distinguished positions in the past. He has been at Yale before Florence, and he has held fellowships from Harvard, the Kennedy School, and the Center for European Studies, and in Paris, and in London, and in Tokyo. Many of you will have encountered him from his earlier book, The Unfinished Peace After World War I, America, Britain, and the Stabilization of Europe, 1919 to 1932. And in many ways, this book is his second in what I think will be a trilogy of books on this period in late 19th through the 20th century. And today he will indeed talk about his new book, which is in the United States, not yet in the bookstores, so it will be soon. But in Europe, it's available. But we're still waiting for it to arrive. We have one precious copy with us right now. You can see it, beautiful cover. The New Atlantic Order: The Transformation of International Politics, 1860 to 1933. Patrick, it's great to have you. Just one more word. Our dear colleague, Harold James, will be our discussant, and he does not require any elaborate introduction, but it's great to have him here to help us think about this new book and to lead us in discussion. So Patrick will speak for 20-some minutes, and then Harold will offer comments, and then we will open it up. For those of you in the room, we will, of course, be open and welcome to hear your comments and questions. Online, we know you're there. We are very eager to hear your thoughts, and so we will be, because this is a Zoom session, not a webinar, we will be turning to you when you flag yourself to give your own comments. So we will ask you to actually speak up when the time comes. So welcome everybody online. We're here in the room at Princeton, and we're going to welcome now Patrick for his presentation. So welcome to Princeton.
Thank you very much. And I should start by saying that I'm very glad to be back here. And in a funny way, one of my last memorable stays here in Princeton was when my first book had just come out in 2006, very long ago. And there was a special conference on reassessing the legacy of Woodrow Wilson. And so it seems that if I really manage it nicely, I might be back within, let's say, the next 5 years for the final volume of this trilogy. But let's see. Yeah, so it's wonderful to be back here. And Woodrow Wilson is again one of the protagonists of my new book. And I would like to start by emphasizing something that he was not a master in, namely to manage and patients. And I'm saying this because I'm on a little book tour on the East Coast. I first came from Europe into John F. Kennedy Airport. And in the airport bookstore, there was a cover of a New York magazine where a former colleague of mine was printed, and he declared, or someone declared for him, "I can explain everything." Yeah, I've since had a debate with him at Columbia, so he will forgive me for saying this. I have to start with disappointing you. I cannot explain everything, but what I will try to do is to give a sense of what this book is about. And I would like to start by doing something that I don't usually like to do, namely to start in the present. Yeah, and I would say we are at a kind of watershed, not moment, but in a watershed phase, which in my interpretation sort of beckons the question whether we are at the end of the long 20th century. And I hope by the end of my remarks, you will get a sense what I mean by that. Yeah, but so periods of war, crisis, can, and this masterful historians from the age of Thucydides through Paul W. Schroeder and many others in this room have shown us can lead to, sort of, first of all, old assurances, old ideas breaking down, old corruptions becoming apparent, and things that don't work anymore. Think of how many Western powers have dealt with Putin until not so long ago, and how they are now talking about how to manage relations with Russia. Yet, as I hope to show in this book, massive crisis can also instigate not linear, not simple, but very important reorientations and learning processes, because precisely it is at these kinds of shocks to the system and to mentalities that, not immediately and nicely fitting with people saying they've learned the lessons of the Great War of history, but eventually different pursuits are being attempted and different things are being done. And in my world, this concerns how the world is ordered. So ideas, mechanisms, institutions, but also deeper understandings of how you actually manage to, in the end, preserve not just something like global peace, but build, and this is very important for this book, a legitimate and durable order. Not just a durable order. We can have all kinds of enduring orders that might be oppressive and bad, but this question of how do you actually, what does it take to build over time a durable international order? And I argue this cannot be disassociated from the question, what makes an order legitimate? Not just for some, not just for victors, not just for the Western powers or whoever you might think, but for all the main players. And that is a complex and gigantic task. And so at the core of this book is a reevaluation of the most complex peacemaking and reordering process in history, which is that of Paris in 1919. And I'm trying, this is the process, peacemaking process of Paris in 1919, but it's also the wider reordering process that occurred between 1914 and the 1920s. So part 4 of this book will give you a new, I hope, quite comprehensive interpretation of what I think was really at stake at that time. And the main argument here is that there was a lot of talk, not least by Woodrow Wilson, about a new world order, new global, new universal principles. But I argue in this book that at the core of what really occurred, for all the ramifications this process had, for the future of Russia, East Asia, Africa, every part of the world, what lay at the core of it was a struggle to redefine the ground rules, understandings, and mechanisms of an Atlantic order, of a Euro-Atlantic order. This was mainly a process in the end at which certain actors, Woodrow Wilson, the leaders of the so-called European victors that had badly been sort of hit by this war, but were still very powerful in shaping the terms of the post-war order. You might think of Lloyd George, and also others, were at the core of a massive pyramid of actors that were trying, already before the end of the war in the West, the armistice of 1918, but of course, especially after that armistice, to redefine these terms. So at the core of the quest for a new world order lay the quest for a new Atlantic order. And this is important, not least because what we have to understand about these periods are are major discrepancies, are gaps, even chasms between words and deeds, between universal terms and hierarchical assumptions that in the end led to this peace being less than legitimate, less than inclusive, and of course highly hierarchical in different ways in global terms. If you think of all the actors, the young Gandhi, Indian nationalists, others who wanted a seat and a voice at the table and said, we also desired self-determination, and Woodrow Wilson and others have used this word. Lloyd George would eventually say, the British Empire is already a kind of League of Nations, rather imperial kind. So what we have to understand then is that part of what made this process so complex is that the actors who were at the core of it could no longer use the old methods of right of victory, old power politics. They had to find a new language and ways of gaining acceptance for what they were doing. This was especially difficult because this is the other argument in the book. This is the first massively complex process that has to be negotiated between leading actors of imperfect but expanding democratic states. So they don't just have to find compromises and complex understandings on the Polish-German border or all the other main tasks in Paris. They also have to think about, how do I gain support for this peace vision that I have, which is not a unilateral one, it's a negotiated one at home. And even further, they have to understand that if only they manage to gain support, but their interlocutors don't, then everything falls apart. Now, this is for me the core of modern international politics, which at the same time I'm trying to open up, because obviously it would be a bit strange to write nowadays the history of, let's say, not so great men, but the main state actors. They are still very central in my history, because in the end, they set a lot of the terms with their advisors, because only they were at the center of power when compromises were made. But of course, as you know, I hope, at this time, massively new kind of actors, associations, pressure groups were trying to say modern peacemaking is much more transparent, it's more open, it cannot just be done in the back rooms between leaders, or it has to be done in progressive kind of peace. And Wilson, of course, raised high expectations to this end, which he managed, but at the 11th hour, when it was really too late. So you have, for example, the great kind of disappointment of progressives in the United States, Jane Addams and the Women's Peace Party, the League of Nations sort of proponents, who thought that Wilson had sold out. And this is too simple a picture. But what I'm trying to show in this book, I call it integrated or comprehensive international history, which in the end is an attempt to say, we should try to write books that are not compartmentalized, that are in diplomatic history or transnational history, or look at some actors but not others. Because in the end, what you have to try, and this is why my book's slightly long, is to get the big picture. And not just to list all these actors and say they had wonderful ideas. So I could list thousands of people who had lovely conceptions about the wonderful League of Nations. But my interest is which ideas filter through to the core of power in the processes that reshape the order. How does this work? Pressure in different ways. So finally, big picture means to include the global aspect. So I'm mainly interested in the EuroAtlantic negotiations. This, of course, concerns the key question, what happened in 1918 after that war with the vanquished powers? So Wilson had originally proposed this is a new kind of peace, even without victory, but an integrative peace. And German liberals, Hungarian liberals, and any others who were also opportunistic at times, when the time came for the peacemaking, they were trying to prepare to get the credentials for the new kind of peacemaking, which meant that you had to have a democratic constitution, you had to show that you wanted to be part of this Euro-Atlantic, apparently progressive democratic order. So in the Weimar example, they had the most modern constitution, much more democratic than the American constitution at the time. But in the end, as we know, and the book tries to offer a new interpretation of why this was so, the peace was made as a more or less imposed peace, dictated peace. There were no substantial negotiations between these actors. And I argue that this had to do partly with the modern exigencies, the complexities of even getting a peace architecture basically off the ground between the victors and the different agendas. So they thought that their kind of edifice that they had built was so fragile that if they now started to negotiate with representatives like Brockdorff Rantzau, the foreign minister of Weimar, everything might unravel. And of course you had some, like the French, not a nationalist, not a reactionary, but a liberal, real politician like Clemenceau, who simply said, we cannot make peace like that because then Germany will be too powerful. So we have to do it in a different way. Nonetheless, what is also at play here, my book tries to show, is not just the complexity of the process, it's also the underlying assumptions. So you have learning processes and reorientations, but you still have very entrenched ideas of who in the end has a claim and legitimacy to set the terms of the world order. Yeah, these are very partly neo-imperial, sometimes kind of connected to ideas of civilization, the Anglo-American civil, sort of those who are entitled to lead this process. And this, of course, caused massive backlashes across the globe, but especially, of course, in Germany. So Max Weber is an early sort of analyst of this and says, this peace will cause more war, not peace. And eventually a certain Carl Schmitt will pick up these ideas and say, when the Westerners, when the Americans talk about universal values, they just want to extend their Monroe Doctrine to the world. So this filters through to the generation of Hitler and so on. So these are massive consequences. And I'm not writing a kind of blame game history where I want to say, look how misguided they were. I'm just trying to show as accurately as I can what actually were their assumptions and did the war cause them to change them. To give you one example, I think that Woodrow Wilson did not undergo a major sort of turning around of the mind. He was a kind of liberal imperialist, a very hierarchical sort of Protestant, Princeton man, if I may say, and he had more of a sense that one had to be more inclusive, but he was a tutelage actor. He wanted to say it has to be controlled by some and others have to follow and have to learn. And most, let's say, consequentially, he was then coming up with this idea that Germany and others had to be put on probation. They had to be show that they were really democratic, but they also had to accept non-negotiated imposed terms. So this created massive legitimacy problems. So these are the second half of the book. Why it is even longer has to do with the wider picture. So what I'm really trying to argue is that even if you think that there was a Wilsonian moment or some other kind of moment, which I don't, if you want to understand what was possible and not possible in this parameter, you have to broaden your focus. And so I try to suggest that you have to look at the long 20th century, which in my interpretation starts around the 1860s, and it is perhaps coming to an end right now, or maybe not. So what do I mean? It dawns in my interpretation at the time when the old, more Eurocentric, Euro-dominated order, the system of Vienna and the European idea that they can basically control the terms of world politics, and the United States having a kind of Monroe Doctrine, Western Hemisphere position that only engages in more informal economic imperialism in China and elsewhere, comes to an end at the time when, as Charles May and others have shown, two dynamic processes are sort of getting off the ground. On the one hand, the globalization of European power politics, the idea that if you want to be part of this club in the future, you have to be a world power. You cannot be just a European power. An unlimited kind of competition for not just formal empire, but for shares in the kind of imperial great game of that time. That's one. The other is the highly sort of dynamic and massive process of modern state formation. So the idea that you had Britain and France, but now you have the unification of Italy and even slightly more consequentially the unification of the German Empire, and you have, in my interpretation, the reunification of the United States after the Civil War. So the idea that there could have been perhaps two sort of competing entities on the North American continent, our world order would look very different. So all these processes are gaining ground in the 1860s. Of course, I don't argue that this all started on the 1st of January 1860, but we have to find some sort of measure. Now, what I'm arguing in the first part of the book is that the developments at the level of the international system, the ideas, the mechanisms, they could not keep pace with these dynamisms. So we have an involution, as I call it, of international politics, where we had understandings of the Vienna Concert before, peaceful resolution of conflicts, avoidance of a massive war between all the great powers. We now have processes that lead by the sort of turn of the chronological 20th century to competing alliance system and balance of power calculations, mobilizations for war. So famously, when the British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey after the crisis, the July crisis escalated in 1914, said, well, but we should still call everyone to London. We have something like a European concert. He still knew the words, but the concert had already been hollowed out. There was no more concert. So they had unlearned, as I would call it, they had unlearned what to do to actually prevent at some point the escalation of a conflict into a massive global war. So a regional problem, a terrorist attack, a kind of Balkan crisis could then escalate into the most massive catastrophe up to that point in human history. So as I argue, and you might see the reference here, they were sleepwalkers only insofar as they could not imagine what kind of war would follow, but they were not at all sleepwalkers in terms of sort of not quite knowing what they did. On the contrary, they did the wrong thing. So these kinds of dimensions we have to understand to see how difficult it was to get out of these mentalities, even through the shock of this great war, to a kind of new terrain. And this leads now to the sort of final trajectory, the arc of this trilogy, because in the end, one of the main arguments here is that it's completely unrealistic after not just the Great War, but the prehistory and decades of these kinds of civilizational Darwinism ideas and so on. You cannot sort of stabilize and create a new system at one peace conference and then think, then you have to enforce it, and that is that. So this is the realist view. It was not sufficiently enforced. One should have contained Germany, because in the end, these are mainly histories written by generations who, of course, look at it through the prism of the Second World War and the 1930s. And there's this sort of idea that you even have something like a 30 years war. So there were mistakes made, but mistakes that were corrected in terms of then having the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany, completely different creature in my book, after the Second World War. And also in terms of having conflicts that could not be canalized or sorted out. And I take a very different view. This comes back to my first book, that namely one had very remarkable progress towards creating a new kind of EuroAtlantic order, not in 1919, but in the 1920s, before the Great Depression. Locarno, so the stabilization of Weimar Germany, the era of Stresemann. If we hadn't had the final shock of the Great Depression and all that caused, we might have seen a stabilization. So what I'm trying to suggest is we need to look at a much longer term, I call it dialectical, but not Marxist dialectical process, where through trial and error, sort of trying certain conceptions, having not done enough, then looking back at things, we get to a kind of 50-year reordering process. So the First World War, the Paris Peace Conference, the 1920s, not creating a system that could withstand the shocks of what happened between 1929 and 1932. Then the rise of these kinds of massive challenges to this idea of a Euro-Atlantic order on sort of liberal principles in the 1930s. So this is not just the period of Hitler and Japanese authoritarianism, but also of Stalin's or industrial kind of countervision. Eventually, then the next book will take this as a starting point and will ask, so how do we then explain what occurred after 1945? And I'm here engaging with another big interpretation that in one generation was sort of advanced by Eric Hobsbawm, obviously. This is sort of the idea that we have a long 19th century, but then a short age of extremes. So it's the Cold War. It's the main issue is we have these two competing sort of systems already in 1916, 17. The US liberal capitalist democratic system, and then the Bolshevik Soviet communist alternative. I argue that it sounds arrogant, but I'm sorry, this is too narrow a view. It's like almost a kind of generational view. And I think a very sophisticated, much broader reiteration of this is Arnie Westad's work. But not again, the main point here is to almost sort of widen the Cold War and to look at the wider origins to go back. I'm trying to argue from, let's say, a historic, more global perspective that we have to go from the past into the present, not to go backwards. And so in terms of the international system, I see a long 20th century, where first attempts to build a new kind of order were made before the First World War. I look at the Hague Peace conferences and the Hague Conventions and the international lawyers who wanted to create a kind of reign of international law, but who were all powerless when the First World War started. So this is already a first attempt. Then we have the post-World War I period, and eventually we have movements towards the working title of the final volume is Pax Atlantica. And yet again, I would hope to show that I'm embedding this in a global context. So these developments have massive global implications, but I also try to look at the question, what was specifically possible in the EuroAtlantic sphere in terms of system building, European integration, the way the United States behaved towards Western Europe, that is so different from what John and others have described, for example, about US behavior in East Asia. Much more centered on the US, bilateral relationships. So what are the factors that change this? Nonetheless, I would argue that if we think of the modern international order and the UN and all we think about, there is an Atlantic core, not in the sense that I think that was so glorious and these are the most advanced people, but if we think of thinkers and policymakers who actually thought of these universal terms, they still often fell short of really universalizing this, and we can see this in the decolonization period and so on, but they were thinking harder about, so what of this can be made global? And this is, in my interpretation, the big challenge after 1989. So this idea that, well, we seem to have the building blocks, even the ideas, now we just have to universalize them, and then we are beyond the end of history. Nowadays, people talk of the return of history. As a historian, I find that strange. I always live with history. But the idea here that it takes much more work, but it also takes a much more understanding of actors who simply do not share the basic assumptions that some in the West, in the United States, and Western Europe have thought should trickle down to all of humanity. And so we are now, I believe, in a period where we have a major systemic new competition because the hegemon of this Euro-Atlantic order has been shown to be very disunited and frail, and who knows where they are going. And we have other competitors who explicitly talk about a different kind of world order and say the time of this kind of order is maybe past. And so my challenge then that comes from this book, that's in the epilogue, it's a sort of preview of the next book, but which I hope to flesh out in the next book, is are we either at the end of this long 20th century where this still matters and now its time has passed and we are more in a kind of hyper-competitive global disorder for a long time? Or is this now a period of, again, crisis, which doesn't immediately, but over time, generate learning, re-evaluation, but also is the sense that we have to get rid of some of the complacencies that I witnessed myself as a young student traveling to Russia. Unfortunately, I don't speak Russian, but in the 1990s, when you had sort of an attitude that this was the Wild East and eventually the United States can maximize its interests and somehow along the way teach them to be a bit more democratic. So we are in a different period, and I would hope, of course, that if all those who are now reshaping the world order read this book, I mean, then the problems will be solved within a week. But other than that, I think it ends on not a kind of pessimistic book note. It's not a deluge book. It's a reordering book. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks, thanks, John. It's really great to be here and to discuss this very interesting and important, I think, book. Although I have to say, I'm skeptical that anything could solve the problems of the world in a week. I don't think. I don't think you meant to say that. So maybe I could offer a couple of reflections before this goes out and before we have a general discussion of these themes. First of all, I wanted to ask you about your choice of the idea of an Atlantic world, and that's the theme that goes through very, very consistently from the 1860s, and I think it's right that you put the US Civil War into this context, and you say that this is the moment that the United States, it's a famous grammatical point, that the United States becomes a singular entity with the Civil War. So you know, it's very powerfully done, but it obviously misses something out. And what it misses, I think, is the kind of alternative view. If you look at that very, very famous map in the Royal Geographical Society that Halford Mackinder provided, you know, the world is centered around the heartland. The heartland is the Eurasian mass. And Japan is a little bit on the periphery, but the United States is also on the periphery, and Latin America is further off on the periphery. And it seems to me that this is a powerful alternative vision that was there from the middle of the 19th century, and it's there today. I mean, it's obviously very famously there today, and you know, you can read Mr. Putin's speeches on this, but that comes from somewhere, and it's particularly elaborated, I think, you know, just before the First World War. It's a reaction to Mackinder, but it pushes the second of my observations, which is that if we'd been having this discussion 30 years or so ago, you know, maybe less, we would have also had my colleague Arno Meyer here, who wrote this really fascinating and I think still important book on 1919 and on the peace conference. And the point of Arno's book was really that the most critical actor of 1919 was absent. And you actually managed not to mention him. You mentioned Stalin, but you didn't mention Lenin.
Really?
In your brief remarks. I mean, you know.
Okay.
So you know, clearly, yes. In your book, there are plenty of references to Lenin. I absolve you of this, but in your brief summary, you didn't have Lenin, and you know, that seems to be one of the really critical moments of 1919, and it sort of also, I think, pushes the idea of what is absent in the world order that you're thinking of as the Atlantic one. And thirdly, you know, maybe that's for me the most crucial point, is that the story of 1919, you know, I think is a story of failure in the end, and a very obvious failure. But you can tell it in a rather different way to the one that I think you do, which is to say that it's a failure to provide any idea of an economic settlement after the war. And so this is the point that reduced Keynes to a white fury in 1919. And it's the point that brought Keynes in the Second World War to Bretton Woods, and to make, and you know, this is what John has written about, to make a viable world order. And so, you know, that's really a question of how you reconstruct this as a economically viable system. And I think you underestimate it in your conclusion, and you know, your conclusion is very brief, and it doesn't really deal with the span of years between 1919 and the early 1930s. You underestimate the idea and the extent to which the Great Depression was pre-programmed by the First World War and by the peace conference. It's not just the peace conference, but it's the impact of the First World War. And that with war debts and reparations, you got an impossible sort of situation. And you know, one figure I think who has done this very, very brilliantly is Albrecht Ritschl. And you know, Albrecht shows very, very convincingly how, you know, an apparently technical issue of shifting the priority between war debts and reparations in 1929 in the Young Plan can blow up the world. And so, this is the moment that blows up the world. And the idea that you got anything near a stabilization of the world in the 1920s is, I think, a fantasy. It's a fantasy because it relies on the United States just pumping enormous amounts of capital exports in a way that is unsustainable. And you could see then, I think, the moment that those capital exports fall off. There's a brilliant picture. I mean, if we had a picture, I would use that. That I think it's the picture that embodies what the Weimar Republic was all about. It's by the artist George Gross. It's called The Eclipse of the Sun in the 1920s. It shows, middle of the 1920s, in the stabilization period, it shows all these sort of empty-minded generals and diplomats sitting around, and it shows the US dollar eclipsing the sun, that the dollar is in the place of the sun. So as long as the dollar shone on the Weimar Republic, it worked. When the dollar didn't shine anymore, it didn't work, and it blew up the world economy and the international order. So, I think that is the story that I would still insist on as the critical story of the failure of 1919. But it made me want to put one final question to you about your beginning and your end. I mean, to some extent, I've already talked about your end. I mean, I think the end of your story is the Great Depression, and that really blows up the peace settlement. But why 1860? I think if you probe a little more on that, you might find something that again shows a kind of interesting angle on the way in which this history develops. I think I would go back slightly earlier to the political revolutions of 1814 and to the a world in which large parts of the European population were dying of either hunger or of epidemic disease that followed in the wake of hunger. And consequently, there was an imperative to go out and get more reliable sources of food. So there was a profound supply shock in the middle of the 19th century. And it's the reaction to the supply shock that then I think is translated into the globalization paradigm in the 1850s and 1860s. And it's the world of Richard Cobden and the heyday of Victorian liberalism. So it's really then a question, I think, of how the world reacts to scarcity in the middle of the 19th century, and how the world reacts actually to scarcity in the middle of the First World War. And trying to plan how to manage scarcity is something that was done well in the middle of the 19th century, but was done poorly and inadequately in the aftermath of the First World War. And so I think, in general, you can see where I'm coming from, yes, that I want a more economic story of both the origins and the end of the story that you're dealing with in this work that focuses so heavily on the mentalities of 1919.
I very much expect that, and thank you. These are very interesting remarks. In a way, I could say very briefly, that is all in the book. And on the secondly, you have basically summarized some of the kinds of schools of thought that in my introduction, which I recommend, I try to summarize on 40 pages, sort of the main interventions. This is all referred to in there. And the book doesn't start in the 1860s. The first chapter goes back to the pre-Congress of Vienna era, then covers the revolutions. So there's a prologue. So as I mentioned, I don't think in the 1860s things start. But the more fundamental point here, I think, is, this is one of my favorite painting by Paul Klee. It's called Main Path and Side Path. I was lucky enough to get the publisher to use it as the cover image, but it's also indicative of what the book is about. It's a struggle. It's not one story being told. It's an attempt to show what are the competing economic, political, and other conceptions that come out of this mid-19th century. If you look at Jürgen Osterhammer's great work on the transformation of the world. So this is the starting point. Out of this come some Atlantic, European, some imperial answers, socialist answers. Yeah, so the first part of the book tries to show this comprehensively, how they competed, yeah, how liberal internationalists, liberal imperialists, the second international, yeah, more Eurocentric, more British-centric sort of actors operated, and how nonetheless, yeah, nothing, sort of this competition was going on, but it didn't lead to a new kind of order. Then we have the Great War, yeah, and during this war, there's a long chapter, I believe it's chapter 7, it's called the ideological and political war within the war. Yeah? And this is exactly the time when German thinkers, Russian and others are thinking of building a Eurasian kind of empire. So I have a new interpretation of the piece of Brest-Litovsk, for example, in this book. Yeah? But my argument is they all had to do this, and they did this partly so radically because they are now in a world that's no longer Eurocentric. So if you look at Ludendorff's young man, a certain Gustav Stresemann, he writes major sort of war pamphlets like many others. And his basic argument is, and he's more liberal later, and he undergoes a learning process, but he says, if the German empire of the future is to be in a position to compete with the great global empires of the future, by which he means the British world system and the United States, then it needs a Eurasian, it needs to go up, it needs to dominate France on the one hand, and it needs to basically command the landmass of Eurasia. So these actors, and this is the new, I hope, scope this book has, it shows that they were not arguing in a vacuum, and later we can see this with a certain Adolf Hitler and many others. These are generations. They relate to a new Euro-Atlantic, well, not only Euro-Atlantic, So, and there's a long chapter then on the Bolsheviks' reaction. So how did Lenin think about Wilson? So for him, Wilson was the most dangerous opponent because he slowed down what Lenin thought should be already a more global civil war where you get results. And for him, Wilson, with his, of course, in Lenin's eyes, feckless sort of talk of League of Nations and all of that, was sort of manipulating the people in the wrong way. So there's an attempt to build on. I'm a great admirer of Arno Mayer's work, but I think that it's not comprehensive in a sense. He was looking at new dimensions. So he was saying we should not look so much at the international politics of Lloyd George. We should look at this underlying struggle. My attempt at being comprehensive, and that's why the third part is rather long, is to say, no, this is one system. So we have to understand all the different layers. And for example, it's undeniable that some of the outcomes of 1919 were related to how different actors used the Bolshevik threat. So either to say, look, we need to do more for the workers or whatever. So there is this dimension, but I simply disagree that this is the cardinal dimension we need to understand, that it's Wilson versus Lenin. This is not what's at the core. Then finally,
Can I just ask you one question there on the realist interpretation that you didn't like? So the realist interpretation says, Germany should have been more constrained. And in fact, the peace treaty was a kind of restraint of Germany in that sense in the French vision, and it was relaxed. A.J.P. Taylor thinks that the departure of the French troops from the Rhineland in 1930 is the key moment. I think that the Lausanne Conference in the summer of 1932 is the key moment when you've taken off the constraints. And once you've taken off the constraints, it's possible for any radical policy to be implemented in Germany. If you'd had Hitler before July 1932, it wouldn't have been possible. He would have had an impossible choice.
But if I may briefly say, so the first thing I should say, of course, I've written an entire book on this. So my epilogue is a new kind of summation of the first book. So I'm not going into all these things again, but the cardinal point is, so I think, the big battle is here. do you think that it would have been a better trajectory to try to stabilize a democratic system in Weimar and to integrate them into the League of Nations with constraints, with, Locarno is not a free-for-all. It is them accepting certain ground rules, for example, not to challenge eastern borders by force. And the French realist view at the time, which I understand, is that whatever the Germans say, they're just preparing for a time when they're strong enough to go beyond this. And I think this view has filtered into what I call retroactive history. This is what you mentioned. It's you go to 1932 or to Hitler, and then you say, oh, they were just preparing the ground. I take a fundamentally different view here, not a blue-eyed view saying this would have been wonderful. I just think a more realistic way of building peace, also with Bolshevik Russia, was not to turn them into pariahs and to sort of constrain them, and to France completely overexerted itself in trying to occupy the Ruhr area. So one of the learning processes takes us from the 1920s towards the coal and steel community of the Atlantic system after 1945, when a much more imaginative solution is being found. So one point, though, is here that, for example, if you look at the origins of NATO, they are French in some ways, because French strategist Tardieu and his sort of thought already in 1917 that they needed to convince the Americans that there's something like what they called an Atlantic security community, because, of course, they wanted not just the League, they thought it was too vague, too general, they wanted real guarantees. And so they wanted to instill, they made immense efforts to convince Wilson and others that American security has to be sort of protected, as they said, on the Rhine. This is the new civilizational frontier. Now we are at the Dnieper. So anyway, so I argue that this is an interesting, understandable kind of thinking. I'm not writing blame game history, but I try to show that this is this was not really conducive to stabilization. Locarno, all the things that happened before the Great Depression, they go in a different direction, and they were not blind, sort of people were not blindfolded, but what they didn't go far enough. So this would be my final point. And these are the kinds of lessons that, if you think of Keynes, Monet, many others, the actors who were then concerned in building the post-1945 order, also the economic one. I have a long chapter on reparations and the economic order. So if you're interested in that, it's called the moral and political stakes of reparations, and it tries to answer the question, why was there no Wilsonian Marshall Plan? This has to do with many factors that I don't want to go into. But for me, and this is also the discussion I had in New York just now with Adam Tooze, yes, we have to, of course, international politics and economics and finances are completely intertwined, but I'm trying to look at the big picture of how they actually interact. So that will be my defense.
Thank you, Patrick and Harold. I wanted to go first to the screen to see if I have any people who want to speak. And I see Steve Kotkin in my upper left-hand corner. Steve, are you there? Do you have a question? And others who might have, you're going to have to signal to me somehow. We've got several here in the room. But I just wanted to see if Steve wanted to start.
Yeah, so we have an Atlantic order today, and we have a very powerful Europe today. And so these are kind of heavily teleological questions in some way when you're dealing like Patrick is with these tremendous contingencies and ruptures. But in the fullness of time, has Europe declined in relative power to the rest of the world? How does the rest of the world organize or affect its power in any international systems? Certainly the UN is a Security Council centered institution. Most multilateral institutions that function are done through European or American appointments. The Federal Reserve is arguably the single most powerful institution in the world that extends beyond borders. So is the conjuncture that you're writing so eloquently about not in sync with some longer term trends that would argue for much greater continuity despite the ruptures and the contingencies?
That's a may I take it in turn?
Yes.
Because I'm not going to speak in this direction for the microphone. So I think that's an excellent question. It maybe also allows me to briefly recapitulate that. So one of the attempts that the book makes that makes it a bit longer is to place all of this in a global context. Yeah, so I am not Jürgen Osterhammer. I don't read Chinese and so on. I have many limitations. So, but I still try analytically and systematically to look at how's the rest of the world, how are the others who are affected by this looking at this. And I mentioned earlier, this is a period, yeah, this is a long period where you had in the era of imperialism, wonderful concepts are used, universal language as part of the US sort of code, yeah, and the British code and so on. But this is the time when a lot of actors, and Aris Manella has shown this, and others have shown this as well, yeah, think that of course they understood that this was not just some naive president who was suggesting that all of a sudden they could just be on the same level as these most powerful imperial states. Nonetheless, the whole cosmos changed, and for every actor, if they are at the top, so to speak, or in the periphery, everything is being renegotiated. And this is also Paris. Yeah? Paris is a global kind of struggle at which it becomes apparent, for example, that certain former empires managed, France, Britain, yeah, to even extend their parameters. We look at the mandate system and so on in a new language. And yet, of course, if one looks at the wider continuity, there's no continuity, but this is a phase in a wider struggle which sets up the constellation after the Second World War and decolonization. And along Ho Chi Minh, many others were already present and had these first experiences around the Paris Peace Conference. So I would still argue that we have crisis and reaction, major ruptures. For example, in the 1930s, if you had looked around the world and said, is it a foregone conclusion that the US will remain a strong democracy and will be a world power, or will it be completely paralyzed by not dealing with the Great Depression, having a neutrality legislation that allows nothing? So I think it's a very interesting, and I mean, John and many others have written about this, but to look at this in this wider scope, how those who were thinking, oh, we need a new internationalist, a different response, were they really thinking in very global terms? Yeah, and so many called themselves internationalists, but for example, in my interpretation, Wilson was not a liberal internationalist. He was a progressive, hierarchical Americanist. Yeah? So he took the US as a sort of starting point. He was not very well versed and experienced in international affairs. His whole language is from the internal New Freedom agenda. And then he globalizes it, but he's not as internationalist as, for example, Jane Addams and the Women's Peace Party, who try to think more in egalitarian terms. Yeah? And I do think that some of the learning processes that come to some kind of fruition after 1945 have to do with people like George F. Kennan and others having still a very hierarchical and Eurocentric sometimes perspective, but also having to learn how to deal with others. And yet they did it in a very imperfect way very often, because of the exigency of the Cold War and so on. But we should look at the struggle, and not presuppose that there was one kind of major direction, a continuity or a big rupture, because if you look at Washington, if you look at any center, it's hardly ever dominated for long by certain actors. There's always a debate, there's always a struggle, and you have to understand who are the players in this. Yeah, and the same is happening around the world. So this is where I'm trying to show what's actually changing.
Thank you. I'm going to go to one question in the room and then back to see Natasha will be next after Tolia. I think you were going to speak, then Natasha, then Andy, I think. So maybe we'll take a couple questions. And sure.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask you a question that relates to several very, very interesting observations that you made. You spoke first of this idea of unlearning and involution from the concert period into what you call the long 20th century. You spoke about the long 20th century as being defined by this globalization of European power politics, as well as the project of rational state building in Europe. And then you also spoke very interestingly about how the 1920s, and in particular Locarno, offers some possibilities for stabilizing these transformative pressures of the long 20th century. And I just wanted to ask you to give us some concrete thoughts about the specific practices, rules, mechanisms that you see evolving in the 1920s that are harnessing that latent potential for cooperation with a view to stabilizing the disruptive dynamics of the long 20th century. Because it seems to me, going back to some of the remarks that Harold made, that there are certain limits or strategic limits to Locarno diplomacy in particular. And once those limits are exhausted, it's not clear that there is a broader project for the stabilization of the global order. So I wonder if you can speak to that. Is it really just a return in effect to the dynamics of the concert of Europe, perhaps globalized, or is there something else that you see there? Thank you.
Should I take them in turn or take a couple? I would prefer the one sort of, otherwise one gets a bit lost.
Okay, we're going to do
so
it.
I'll be brief if
So
that's
Natasha,
okay.
just hold on.
Yeah, sorry, but so yeah.
But I want to ask you about Woodrow Wilson. So
yeah, so that's very, yeah, it's very interesting. So my operative term is that of the concert, but the book tries to show that some actors would have liked to go back to some kind of more democratic European concert, but they had to realize this was no longer possible because there was a US player that did not sit at the table, yeah, at the London conference of 1924 at Locarno, but that was actually in the background, yeah, sort of using informal means of being a kind of quiet hegemon, yeah, that was resented for that because it didn't make not the kinds of commitments. Yeah, it did not consider joining the league after all or doing other things, but that still was setting the terms. Yeah, so. And one of the problems in the 1920s is that Herbert Hoover and many others conclude that this is actually very cost effective. Yeah, we can have our cake and eat it. We can we don't have to commit American tax money or security, and we can still have the outcomes that we like. Yeah, they did more, and this is the other part. There's a Washington conference. Yeah, so Locarno is not a global; it has global implications because it stabilizes Europe. But it's and so. People in East Asia look at this and think, can we have other formats? Yeah, because we have a huge question: what will be the future role of Japan, Chinese sovereignty? Yeah, there's a Magna Carta for China. Is this just an imperial device, or is there more to it? Yeah. So Charles Adams Hughes, who is Wilson's successor, sort of, and trying to craft a policy, he's much more active. He's present at Washington. Yeah, this is a formal commitment because this concerns the global naval regime and the new economic order of the world. Yeah, so these are all So the book tries to show exactly what the discrepancy sometimes was between rhetoric and global kind of ideas and the realities of functioning. Actually, you sort of nitty-gritty. If you have an actual concert with a treaty where you say, we are actually now in a collective security system. If anyone sort of violates the border, then the others will turn against them. You are in a different part. You're in a different world from saying this is something that we might discuss. So the symbol of this is the Caliban Pact. Yeah. So for internationalists and intellectual historians, this is such a crowning achievement. But in my world, it's a very ephemeral achievement because in the end, it has no sanction and other mechanisms. It expressed the hope of eradicating war, outlawing war even. But if I remember correctly, after 1928, it didn't exactly work. Yeah, and of course, those who were celebrating the pact of the Caliban Pact, they had how were they going to deal with Hitler? And I think this debate we have nowadays, you have strong, for example, pacifist sentiment in Germany and elsewhere saying we don't want to go back to this world of delivering weapons to Ukraine. But what do you do when somebody doesn't play with the rules anymore? And my book tries to argue this was not a foregone conclusion. The Weimar Republic is not pre-Hitler Germany. It's the Weimar Republic. And then we have to understand why it failed and why many others failed. So it's a much bigger story than that. But the concert idea, I think you can take all the way towards the UN Security Council. Always this idea you want to have something that's global, like an assembly where everyone has a voice, and then you need some steering mechanism. How do you justify it? So there was a League Council, then you have the Security Council, and now we have the G20 and so on. This is the idea of a more complex modern concert. And finally, this always, I think, has to take into account this legitimacy dimension, because you can do all these things, and if you don't manage as the actor to win the next election or to be to justify what you're doing at home, this will be worthless. And this is a big political task. So I don't call this diplomatic history because it's not a diplomatic task, it's a political task. That's why the book also is called The Transformation of European Politics. It tries to show how broad the scope of politics became. Max Weber famously said, politics is this drilling of thick planks of passion and determination, and trying to show the planks change, the drilling change, the ideas of what sort of sort of what act you were engaged in. And that's what we have to capture. And economics are part of that, ideas are part of that, but it's not this kind of, the problem I think in history nowadays is very often, I call it compartmentalism. So in transnational history, doing this and that, and you don't understand the whole thing. And you don't, and this is an attempt to suggest that maybe we can try.
Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you for that, Patrick. It was fascinating, and I very much look forward to reading the book. So thanks for coming and talking to us about it at Princeton. Like many others, I was intrigued by the periodization of this book and what you're doing with start points and end points, and with the 1860s and these moments of great state unification, as you mentioned. And you also mentioned Charlie Mayer by name, and I couldn't, of course, help thinking about his own argument about this new era of the territorialized state that begins around the 1860s and extends through to circa the 1970s, what he calls this kind of century, right, of territory and of a particular sort of sovereignty. I wondered then, zooming out, about how to think about his story in relationship to yours, essentially how you understand the relationship of the history of international order to the history of kind of what's going on with the nature of the state and the state's capacity. Are those two things part of the same story? Is your story the kind of international, like, is this the international modality that the territorialized state produces? Do we learn something different about his story via yours, or yours via his? Or are these two things actually quite separate? I was wondering if you could tease out the relationship of the state and international order that your book either assumes or that you've worked out explicitly.
Very explicitly, and thank you. It's a great question. And I can start by saying that about 5 days ago, I discussed this with Charles Mayer at Harvard, so right on this topic. And very much, these are very intertwined in my approach. So let me talk this way. So these dimensions are very intertwined, because so another agenda of this book is to suggest that there is an interesting way of thinking about modern order or disorder as a succession of imperial regimes. So we have the long 19th century territorial empires, but of course, if you look at the United States, it's a territorial empire that subjugates the native population of North America, but otherwise it uses all kinds of extraterritorial, economic, and other means. You cannot capture US imperialism if you say it's a territorialized kind of empire. So there is something more going on already in the 19th century. But obviously, many books have been written about, and my former colleague, John Gaddis and others have had very influential interpretations that, again, come back to this Cold War theme, that the only thing that can supersede this kind of regime is new super empires. So it's the American super empire, more benign perhaps, but it's a kind of empire, and the Soviet empire. So it's the same iteration in this new struggle. And I take issue with that, because my underlying interest is to ask what were the prospects and the problems and limits of founding a legitimate, stable, global, interstate and international order. And 1919 is one of these phases when, of course, many of the actors who wanted to be no longer subjugated under colonial rule or colonial influence, as you of course know, they first had to get recognized as a state actor. They couldn't sort of build an empire yet. So the new norms, the new ideas, they are state-centered. And yet some of the biggest states in this process are, of course, imperial states, or John Darwin would call them even global systems. So Britain is a state that has a parliament and has all kinds of political necessities in the UK, but it also has a global system. So again, you need a wider lens to understand France. There's the imperial France, and there's the mainland France obsessed with Germany. Then German sort of ideas, do you need a kind of Eurasian empire? Do you need to subjugate half of Eastern Europe? A multinational new kind of, if you think of Ludendorff and his entourage around Brest-Litovsk. So I'm trying to ask, so what was it possible, and to what extent was it possible to do what Wilson suggested, that you have a league of, he called it a League of Nations, but you could also call it a League of States. So part of what I'm doing is to go back in time to show that these kinds of debates have been around since Thucydides. So there's, to go back in the 18th century, so what is a legitimate state? But I'm also trying to suggest that there is a difference between calling everything in the end a new form of empire, yeah, whatever it is. I prefer then the terms of state actors and hegemonies. Yeah, so that this is not Gramsci kind of hegemony. It's more a power plays a leading role. How do they act? Yeah, according to what kind of premises do they impose what they do? Do they consult? Do they actually use a language that negates what the others are trying to do? Yeah, you would say we want self-determination, but if you determine your affairs in a way I don't like, I don't recognize it. And this happened, of course, all the time. Yeah, so there's a lot of US, if you think of US legitimacy deficits, they have a lot to do with US conduct in Latin America, later in the Cold War, eventually Vietnam, eventually Iraq, and so on. It's obvious that there is a huge gap between the lovely sort of whatever is proclaimed and what is how one acts. And many US American actors acted differently towards European states. This has many reasons that have to do with mentalities. But the core interest, again, is sort of the argument is, I don't think that one could have an imperial global order. I wouldn't call it an order because it's a competitive system. And so the question at the end of this long century, 20th century is this the future? So a competing kind of, we have an American, Chinese, Russian, of course, Russia playing on a completely different playing field in all ways, but basically this idea, no more is possible because in the end, it's too complex. The power cannot be regulated. And against that, this is where I think the Atlantic century shows something that was possible, that was very imperfect, that had many problems, but that we should not just sort of jug out and say this was all just a pipe dream and we need to be more realist again, because this kind of realism to me is ideological, it's not realistic.
I've got, thank you, I've got Andy next.
So I really enjoyed reading the book and hearing the talk. I agree with what I think your hypothesis is, which is that the early 20th century settlements weren't stable politically because they weren't legitimate in a deeper sense. They weren't legitimate in a deeper sense because they didn't resolve fundamental conflicts between different conceptions of national identity, different economic interests, and different political ideologies. And then people would fight over that. So I have two questions, I guess. One sort of trivial and one, I think, more important. The trivial question is, particularly after Harold's comments, I'm trying to figure out what's new about this. I'm not saying it isn't new. I just would like to hear you say what is new about it, because Keynes and Weber and Arno Mayer and other people have been talked about this. It's sort of what I learned from, everything from James Joel's textbook on World War I on down, and what I teach students. So is it the synthetic ambition that's new or something else, or what? And the second thing is, and this is more serious, I think, why do you characterize this as optimistic? It seems to me you're acknowledging half of what it means to have a socially embedded interpretation of this process, which is the potential for transformation. So we can make the world a better place if we get these things right. But you mention also the other half, which is it makes it a whole lot more difficult to do that because you have to work through these social mechanisms in order to achieve anything. You can't just turn everything over to Jane Addams. So it is the difference between 1918 and 1945 might not just be what you call learning. It's that history took a path which created new social circumstances which were tractable to get to where we want to get. But in either, that's a relatively pessimistic account of international politics. It means you can only do a relatively limited amount in the structural domain that is the hand you're dealt.
So the first question, my short answer would be, if you've read the book and if you've listened to me and you still think it's nothing new, then maybe I will not reach you. My longer answer would be, so in my view, think of, so most previous interpretations have rather rigid and, in my view, rather narrow premises. They see the Order of Vienna in a certain way, they look at imperialism in a certain way, they look at what actually the Great War did in a certain way, and they have usually national proclivities on what was supposed to happen in 1918. a wonderful and standard work on this is Sarah Steiner's magisterial work. Yeah. So if you read my book, I fundamentally disagree systemically with every single part of this. So what the Vienna system was, yeah, this is, I think Paul W. Schroeder has written more eloquently than anyone about that this was not a kind of realist restoration of something. It was a revolutionary European attempt to create a more almost supranational, supraliberal order that, but textbooks might say at some point, it fell apart, but I've never been very satisfied with why. So I'm trying to offer in the first part the answer that I've tried to outline already. I don't want to repeat it. So then secondly, most histories of the Great War and the 1920s, and especially Versailles, are written usually in the prologue, with a prologue. Yeah, there's a short prologue on what we all seem to understand about how we got to 1914. And if you read lots of these books, especially at the 100th anniversary, that was not so long ago, they usually rehash old and very questionable interpretations that I find very narrow. So the book is an attempt to do both, not to say I'm sort of in this compartment, and so I give you, not based on original research, just a rehash of what people have said about 1914 before. So, and one of my ways that I found helpful was to engage with Chris Clark's very interesting, but to my mind, on this wider point, misleading view. But this is a debate. So when you do that, and you get to this part of what does it mean to write about the big picture, and it takes long to write about it when in every respect you try to combine conceptual history and source-based empirical history. So that's what the book does. So the first part is archivally based, the second, third, and so forth. And that usually is not done. Eric Hobsbawm never wrote this way. I'm not comparing myself here. It's just a very different, it's a different history. Arno Meyer did groundwork, but on his corridors, on his trajectories. And of course, if you read that, you do not understand a lot what was happening in Paris, but you get a whole dimension that others had sort of neglected. If you put this all in the big picture, I would argue only then can you evaluate, for example, how serious was Lenin's threat and role in 1919? If you only focus on the workers and those who listen to Lenin, you think, my God, Lenin was on the cusp of sort of changing everything. And of course, a wider history shows that why that was not the case. And so I could go through all these different stages, and that's why I think the real attempt is to, for me, a model would be Paul W. Schroeder on the transformation of the long 19th century, the Vienna system, and of course Jürgen Osterhammel's work systematically of remapping and having a whole new conception of the 19th century. And those are big shoes to fill, obviously, but that's the attempt at least. And so this I would also then take to the sort of looking towards the next book. So it's not a kind of new history of the Cold War with a little more pre-1945. It's rather taking you from here. There's an epilogue which basically sort of summarizes main arguments of the next book. The next one will have a sort of introduction that I hope shows that much more was at stake than you can't start in the 1930s. You can't start in 1919. You can't start in 1914. So long-term systemic history. And once you've mapped that out, that's an offer. Let's say you can say, I find this interesting, but it doesn't change my sort of basic understanding. But that's what I've tried to do. So that would be my sort of approach. I think I forgot your second.
On optimism.
Oh, the optimism. No, there's no. So the key here is processes. What I'm interested in processes and not sort of, and the main argument is, especially in the modern era, you do not create a kind of status quo. You create a kind of system that can deal with immense change and ever new iterations. The European Union, in whatever way, is one such attempt that has obvious limits that now become apparent, for example, in the strategic sphere. So I'm less interested in sort of saying, oh, this treaty really settled it, or something like that, because in modern international politics, look at the US political calendar, you cannot set things in stone. So it's much more important if you have the kind of instrumentalities and mentalities to deal with it. And in my view, the Vienna Congress, and almost sort of the Vienna Concert did that for a while in the European context. And the big challenge was to find some mechanism that could do that. The UN was supposed to be it, but for obvious reasons, it could not be, that could actually achieve this for the globe in the long 20th century. And that's an ongoing search, I would say. I wouldn't be optimistic that now it would be very easy if we only talk differently to the Chinese leadership, then we can, yeah. But I'm trying to show what is at least the minimum requirement if we want to get there. And that's what the book tries to convey.
Thank you. We're going to take 5 more minutes. I know we're right up on the end, but I want Michael a question, and then we'll wrap things up.
And you have a
I will ask a question,
right?
I'll save it for dinner.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm an economist, economic historian, and my question is, and I didn't read your book, so I apologize.
That's not even out yet, so here.
I want you to talk a little bit about the relationship between economic integration, globalization, and the international economic order on the one hand, and then the international political order. And are these two orders running on separate tracks, or is there interaction? What is the interaction, and what's the causality in this interaction?
Well, that I can have a very short answer. No, I can't. So they're deeply intertwined. I mean, that's what I'm trying to show. The last time I debated this was with Paul Kennedy. So if you read his Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, then it's the economic understructure that shapes the politics. So if you are the top economic and financial power, the British power, then you set the terms. A former colleague of mine who I mentioned at the beginning is Adam Tooze, who has written a very interesting and thought-provoking work on the deluge, where also his main, the turning point is when Britain has to be sort of indebted to the United States to pay for the Great War. And there is this rather unprepared, but now new dominant financial economic power. So my book tries to show that these were especially absolutely essential dimensions of peacemaking and the economics of peace, but they are part again of a bigger picture. So you had, for example, Thomas Lamont and other sort of advisors in 1919, who were debating with the British delegation and the young John Maynard Keynes. Keynes proposing something like a new Marshall Plan regime, but the Americans saying, no, we will not have such sort of official loans and things that will involve US commitments and taxpayers' liabilities. So there were different schools of thought, but I'm trying to show that it's not enough to understand the economics of this or the finances. That's also important, but in the end, there are moral and political dimensions on reparations, on Europeans having to pay for their own war, the United States not wanting to become at that time, in the views of these elites, a kind of state that raises taxes and creates a kind of massive state, modern state that can play such a role, that can give loans, that can, and so on. So I think one has to understand all these interconnected dimensions, and nonetheless, of course, Keynes' provocative treatise, which is first a memorandum inside the delegation, then a big book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. My epilogue is called The Political Consequences of the Peace, but of course they were intertwined with reparations, with war debts, with, sort of, economics are a means of politics, and politics is influenced by economics. So the book tries to show in a comprehensive way how this actually worked.
Well, thank you, Patrick. I think this has been just a terrific session. We would thank you for taking us through what is a magisterial piece of scholarship that will be important and debated for many years to come. We want to be part of that debate. We started it today, and there'll be more later today, and when some of us talk more about specific aspects of the book this afternoon and evening. But thank you for coming, and will you join me in thanking Patrick for
I look forward to continuing with this.